This is Pete Wolfendale, who is going to talk to us about autonomy, AGI, and freedom.
Freedom, reason, and AGI today.
Freedom, reason, and AGI. Autonomy tomorrow. So, welcome, Pete.
Right. I'm hoping to do this perhaps slightly more informally than I normally would. So I'm happy to take questions as we go. If you've got a question, just put your hand up and I'll try and engage with you. I might say it's okay, we'll get to that today, or I'll get to that later, but it's helpful to kind of have a little bit of discussion as we go, if possible. So the title of my talk, as I just said, is Freedom, Reason, and AGI. AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. I don't know if anybody's got the chance to read the David Burch piece in The Guardian that I put up for recommended reading, and that kind of explains the difference between AGI and AI, but I'll just go through that again quickly. So artificial intelligence as a program was initially about trying to create something like a human intelligence, whatever that is. Trying to artificially create something that resembled us. Now, as the program went on and the sort of manifest failures to do anything like that occurred, it got sidetracked largely into what are essentially kind of algorithmic heuristics. It got sidetracked into, well, how do you do things like create robots that efficiently can, go around the floor and vacuum the whole space, without missing any spots, or particular little, solution, computational solutions to practical problems. So the sort of height of that sort of brand of AI is automated translation that you get on Google these days, where you have this sort of approach whereby what they've essentially done is to get a lot of source material. You've got a lot of like initial data as well. You have this English piece and we have this French piece, and we know this is a translation for this. Right? You get a lot of those pairs, and you work out a kind of evolutionary algorithm which will try lots of different ways of trying to get from one to the other until you get one which seems to kind of fit the data set. And what you end up with is something that you haven't designed, you don't know how it works exactly, you can't extend it, but it can do the job really, really well. And that's the sort of thing that sort of the paradigm of AI has ended up in. That and things like chess playing computers and video game sprites. However, there's an increasing recognition that this is diverged from the original project, and that in fact one of the important reasons that it diverged from the original project is that the original project didn't really know exactly what it was doing. And so an attempt to kind of specify what the original project was is to add the G and say, well, we're not just interested in artificial intelligence, we're not just interested in creating computers that can do certain varieties of parochial tasks, perhaps better than we can do them, but we're interested in something like general intelligence, which is something like us, right? There's still a question as to what that means, though. And in fact, what the David Deutsch piece I recommended you read says is, or he claims, is that really this is a philosophical problem. That the real problem standing in the way of artificial intelligence isn't an engineering one, it's a conceptual one about what exactly it is we're trying to do. And that's the problem that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to be talking about it, and I'll get back to this, but I'm going to announce my intentions at the beginning by talking about Immanuel Kant. Because I think Immanuel Kant was basically doing artificial general intelligence about 200 years ago. Some people think that's a little bit of a strange claim, but I hope to kind of justify that as we go through. Kant was interested in what a mind is, who's interested in what a mind is independently of what it's made out of. So what Kant calls transcendental psychology is the attempt to describe what the sorts of things that the mind had to be able to do and how those things had to be able to relate to one another to constitute a rational agent, which is what he thought we are and what he thought. He actually thought he thought he was describing the structure of alien minds as well. Kant was quite sci-fi for his day, and he thought there was alien life on the planets. And he wanted, he explicitly thought that his account applied to them as well. He just didn't quite get as far as robots or artificial intelligence. Anyway, I'm going to go through this problem backwards. So I'm going to start out with intelligence and go through generality and then get to artificiality. And then we'll get into Kant. So does anybody have any initial questions before I delve into intelligence? No, okay? Okay. Right. Right, what is it that we're trying to do with artificial general intelligence? What is it that we're trying to create? What do we mean when we talk about intelligence? It's kind of useful to talk about some of the other words that get thrown around here. So when we're trying to create something which is equivalent to us in some important sense, some people will say what we're trying to do is create consciousness. Some people will say, well, really an AGI has to be self-aware. Or they'll say, well, it's got to be autonomous, it's got to have autonomy. Or they'll say, it's got to have personhood, it's got to be a person. Right? There's a bunch of other terms that kind of get thrown around here and are sometimes taken to be interdefinable and sometimes not, and aren't always specified very well. I like to point out that consciousness and self-awareness are fairly problematic terms. Self-awareness simply because there's an important sense in which fairly trivial systems can be self-aware. Any system that represents its own states in any kind of functional way can be taken to be self-aware in some sense. So, or you can define awareness in terms of, and for instance, you can also define consciousness as simply what it is not to be asleep. So like wakefulness. And so that these words have problems, and there's a particular one that turns up with consciousness, which I just want to flag, which is that, and this is not a problem just for artificial intelligence, this is a problem for philosophy of mind in general. People have a tendency to say that there's this incredible hard problem of consciousness. What is consciousness? And when you ask them, well, okay, what do you mean? What is it you're trying to get us to describe? They'll go back through a bunch of these kinds of words like self-awareness or reflexivity or whatever, and inevitably they end up at something like, well, it's this thing here, right? I'm like, what? And they're like, well, we're both conscious, you're conscious, you should know what I'm talking about. I go, I don't. Like, you're trying, they end up at this kind of point of trying to do a kind of internal pointing. Like, it should be obvious that we're conscious. We've got this weird thing. Look how weird it is to be what we are, right? Surely that's a difficult problem. And I don't think it's a difficult problem. I think it's a pseudo problem. It's there's no interesting question there, which is why it can't be answered, not because it's a hard question. So anyway, what I'd rather do is say, I talk about consciousness and self-awareness and autonomy and personhood. I'll rub these out quickly. But I think what these actually address is two different things, which is, on the one hand, thought, and on the other hand, action. And these words aren't particularly that much better defined than these ones, but I think from starting from this distinction we can actually get to some better distinctions of what we're looking at. And particularly, this is how we'll get to the other crucial terms of the talk, which is reason. I think fundamentally thought is about reasoning, and action, which really what we mean by that is freedom. And I will discuss both of these things later. Now, there's two additional perils I'd like to describe in terms of trying to think of intelligence in relation to this sort of distinction between thought and action. The first is that there's a tendency by some, I take Nick Land to be in this camp, along with a lot of classic AI, treats intelligence as just the capacity to solve practical problems. So, you know, the Roomba is intelligent; it can solve this problem of, you know, working out an efficient route which will cover the whole carpet. You know, and in this sense, animals are intelligent because they can solve certain problems like how to find food or how to raise young or within certain given environmental constraints. There are two kind of perils to doing this. One is that if you define intelligence just as practical problem solving, you end up collapsing the distinction between thought and action. You think of thought principally in practical terms, which what it does is to disguise what you might think of as the general infrastructure of the kind of intelligence we have, which is a sort of arbitrary ability to represent things in the world and think about them independently of what we intend to do about them. Like, on the basis of being able to represent those things and reason about them, we can then do a whole load of stuff, but our ability is functionally distinct. Like the actual additional practical capacities we get from being able to represent as much as we like, rather than, say, the bird that can just represent particular features of its environment that it has evolved to identify. Right? The additional practical capacities we get from that have to be understood in terms of its distinctness from its use in law. So, on the one hand, intelligence as problem solving collapses these two things, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. On the other hand, it leads to a certain kind of temptation, which is you end up losing the qualitative distinction between things that are intelligent and things that aren't. So you end up, there's a kind of slippery slope towards thinking that, well, towards basically panpsychism, which is the idea that there's some sense in which everything has a the reason for this is that there are perfectly good descriptions of pretty much all physical systems which treat them as information processing. So if you can understand a galaxy as solving a certain fairly complicated gravitational problem, right? If you don't want to say that that means the galaxy is intelligent, if you want to say, well, actually, no, intelligence as a term has more meaning, then you need to figure out where to draw the line between where we are, you know, various different forms of animal cognition, various different forms of machines like thermostats, and down into, and so that's another kind of peril here, is qualitative distinction. Right, that's so my sort of basic program is, I think that in order to tackle both of these sort of perils, these temptations, what we need is an explicit definition of intelligence, and I think it's an explicit definition of intelligence as rational agency. Rational agency which combines thought, action, and reason and freedom, but without collapsing them. articulates them as two parts of a single structure. And in doing so, what we get is a qualitative distinction between things that are rational agents and things that aren't. I'm a rational agent. You guys, I believe, are rational agents. This chair is not. A piece of chalk is not a rational agent. Great. So that's what I'm aiming towards. It's what I think counterintuitive and resources do. Okay, so that's intelligence. Generality. Well, I've already kind of stumbled on generality a bit because precisely what seems to distinguish the Roomba and the bird that has learned how to make its nest out of its particular environment and take care of its young and find food, and us, is that there's a certain kind of parochialness to the way they engage with their environment. The Roomba has been designed to handle a very particular environment, and so it takes certain kinds of information which it can form certain kind of limited sort of representations with, and solve certain limited sets of problems, right? But similarly, the bird has evolved and adapted through its its species has adapted to a certain kind of environment, and it's far more complex than the Roomba, but there's still a sense in which it's kind of parochial in terms of the kinds of sensory input it can make sense of and what it can do with them, the kinds of problems it can solve. And there's some sense in which our intelligence is more general than that. Precisely because we are capable of representing the world in a whole, variety of ways, and not just in a variety of ways that has a kind of like a boundary we simply haven't hit, but it seems to be kind of like indefinitely extensible. We can keep developing, for instance, new experimental apparatuses that enable us to study things that we can't, sense in the way that animals can sense their environment. We could start having a conversation about neutrinos if we wanted to, like we almost did earlier. So we're capable of representing things that are outside of what we've biologically evolved to discriminate, and we are capable of reasoning about their features, and then on that basis, we are capable of doing things that previously we were incapable of doing. We're capable of speculating about whether or not we can start using neutrinos to send faster than light speed signals through the planet. The generality of our ability to represent the world, it sort of feeds into directly a certain generality of our ability to act in the world, because we're able to represent goal states that previously we couldn't necessarily conceive. Now, the way I define this is basically, so how do we define this generality? I define it basically as arbitrary extensibility. It's this idea that we can extend the set of things we are capable of representing, both in the sense of we're capable of extending our ability to represent world states and our ability to represent goal states. A kind of good parallel example of this is productivity in language. If you ever done any linguistics, this is one of the first things that people bring up, is the fact that most of the sentences I've just spoken in the past, however long I've been speaking, haven't been spoken by anyone in the whole history of human life. We are capable of understanding completely novel combinations of syntactic tokens, right? So there's this kind of productive novelty, which is encoded into the very structure of language, and that's a good example of this kind of this generative extensibility. We can start putting together arbitrary representations that have not heretofore been used. They haven't been generated out of some kind of specific evolutionary adaptive process. Right. Here's an interesting example, actually. Enmity, like being an enemy of someone.
The enemy.
Yeah. I get this from Ben Singleton because we've been having an argument about this. We often talk about things within nature, within ecosystems. We talk about relationships within kind of purposive terms that are fairly easily to understand for humans. And sometimes we think like there's a kind of there might be like a relationship of enmity between two species, or between two. They're in conflict, they're at war, or. But these are importantly analogical. They're not really enemies. They're not really at war. Like there might be kind of competition between two animals for the same territory, but if one of them disappears and wanders off, the other one is not going to kind of follow it and try and get revenge or destroy its plans. And there's a kind of nice little neat logical way of thinking about this, which is to say that you can only have like really real, like true, like extreme enmity at the point at which you have the ability to generally represent arbitrary outcomes. Because say, I mean, we're going to use horrible philosophical letters here, but say, so I'm Pete, right? And say there's my nemesis is Paul, and so I want Pete, right? I just want something, right? I want I want this particular job or whatever. Paul, being my like absolute enemy, wants whatever I don't want, right? He wants not pay, right? And so for any desire I come up with, I can be like, well, okay, I can't get that. Well, I want Q then. And Paul's like, no, I want you not to have that because I hate you. This kind of like general enmity is only possible on the basis of being able to arbitrarily represent goal states, particularly being able to arbitrarily represent whatever goal states your enemy is representing. You can say, like, whatever you want, I want you not to have it. Right. I don't know if that example made much sense, but I'm quite entertained by it. So, intelligence, some kind of relationship between thought and action. Generality, arbitrary extensibility. Artificiality. What do you mean by artificiality? Well, basically something we can make, right? But what does that imply? What does it imply to say that something is such that we could make it? Well, loosely, it means that it's something whose function we can decompose, or we can functionally decompose what it does into a series of subsystems, and then figure out how to build those subsystems and put them together to recreate, to reconstitute it. Matt, wherever he is, has a really good paper by Reza talking about the significance of Turing. It's Katrina. Oh, it's Katrina who said. Okay. Reza talking about Turing, where Turing has this paper where he's arguing that precisely artificial general intelligence is possible, and he's arguing, or preemptively arguing, against a lot of people who say, no, it's impossible because you'll never be able to make a machine that can love. You're never going to be able to make a machine that can be friends with someone. You're never going to be able to make a machine that can do X or Y or Z, or like write poetry, and there's this kind of like continuous list of things that people have always said, or you can never make a machine that can do these things. And that list keeps getting shorter as we keep building better machines. But the interesting point that Reza makes is that this very form of argument depends upon being able to specify the things that you claim can't be incorporated. But the actual process of specifying them ends up being functional decomposition. So you end up beginning on saying, well, oh, but what about love? And we go, okay, well, let's think about what love is then. Let's think about what love is and what it would be to actually. And as soon as you're on that path of like trying to understand what the thing is, you end up on the path of functional decomposition, and then all you've got to do is incorporate that within your functional mapping. Great. The only thing that can stand up against it is something mystical, something ineffable. And that kind of brings back to my initial point about consciousness, where the arguments about the impossibility of creating AGI have a tendency to collapse back into, well, there's this kind of primitive reflexivity, or there's this primitive kind of like thisness that I don't think you're ever going to be able to catch. And the reason that you can never capture it is because they can never specify what it is. If you can specify what it is, generally we can figure out how to reconstruct it. Now, what is functional explanation? This is actually quite important, because if you understand what it is to engage in functional explanation, there's a certain kind of neat way into the problem of artificial general intelligence. First of all, it's important to, and I mentioned this last night during Katrina's talk, it's important to kind of make a distinction between what you might want to call ideal functions and maybe sort of real mechanisms. In maths, a function is just something like fx. A function is just something that takes an argument and gives you an output. You give it a value of x, it gives you a value of y. Right? All you need to specify a function is what's on this side and what's on that side, and you don't care about how you get from one side to the other. And in fact, the whole problem of computer science is which functions are effectively computable, just to say which functions out of the whole space of these things you can specify can you actually build something that's capable of traveling from one side to the other. The question of building those things, of creating a means to the end of something like this, is the question of what you might call teleological functions rather than mathematical functions. These are, so say the function of the heart is to pump blood around the body. Right? The function of my DVD player is to effectively play DVD. Right? This kind of this form of judgment, where we talk about things as having functions or purposes, is incredibly useful. Just take the case of biological understanding. Right? Biology would not work without functional explanation, without being able to talk about the ways in which the various different organs in the body and compose various different systems which themselves work together and interact in ways that enable the overall functionality of the human body, or any biological organism you want to talk about. The reason for this is it's a little bit trying to decide how technical to get here, but I'll try the technicality and we'll see if it sinks in. Basically, there are two different kinds of inference. There's what you might call, well, what gets called monotonic inference and non-monotonic inference. A monotonic inference is an inference which is exceptionless, right? In physics, if you apply a certain force of a certain dimension to a certain mass, it will produce a fixed amount of acceleration, right? And that's exceptionless, more or less. But you also get inferences which are more like defaults. So a good example of this is if I strike a match on a piece of sandpaper, it'll light. That's a pretty good inference. Unless, of course, I'm in a strong magnetic field, in which case it won't. Right? But by default, we'll say, yeah, that's a good inference. That's fine. It's just if you get additional information, namely R, that'll function as what's called a diffeser to this inference. Now, a diffeser. So one way of describing monotonic inference is to say it's indefeasible, whereas non-monotonic inference is feasible. It actually makes a lot of sense in terms of practical reasoning, because like one of the things that one of the big problems with, say, Kant's categorical imperative is that basically Kant just thinks of all reasoning as being exceptionless. So, like, you should never tell a lie. Like, you know, if doing this implies that you should tell a lie, then you shouldn't do this, right? Like, under any circumstances. Whereas, really, moral principles of that kind are much more like, well, by default, don't lie. But if someone's got a gun to your head and is threatening your life, you know, to, you know, admit that you are a CIA mole, just tell them whatever they want to hear, right? That's probably what you should do, right? Now, how this relates to functional explanation is that when we're making inferences about how things like biological systems are going to work, they're not indefeasible. So I say, well, I just talk about how we describe, if I'm talking about Amy's body, like, basically, your heart should pump blood around your body. Amy, you know, should be perfectly fine eating, you know, that bolognese. It should provide her with enough energy, you know, to keep functioning for the next few days. You know, the ATP molecule interactions that are going on in your cells should keep on working, you know. So I can, you know, I feel safe in inferring that Amy is going to be fine as long as she's been eating right, you know, the past few days. You know, that doesn't take into account potential defeats like, you know, the ticking time bomb aneurysm that's sitting somewhere in your brain, perhaps. Who knows? There are various different things that invalidate those kinds of conclusions, predicting how a biological system like Amy is going to work. This is even more clear in kind of engineering. We're just building things at the back of functional reason. And what functions enable us to do is to organize diffeasors to inference. So a good way of looking at this is in terms of like parts and wholes. This makes, not exactly this way, but it's very interesting in terms of putting together. So basically, if a part is a means to the end as a whole, right? If the function of the part is to play some role in executing the function of the thing as a whole, right? So in my DVD player, there's a little laser which is supposed to kind of, you know, bounce off the DVD, bring information, right? As long as that's working, right, that will contribute to the function of the whole and everything will be fine, right? But we know that if that fails, then the whole will fail, right? Well, our ways of reasoning about the behavior of the whole system can be organized in terms of how failure cascades through the various different functional subsystems. And we're able to do that by using this talk of purpose, of acting as if it is the purpose of this thing to do that particular thing. It's the purpose of, you know, your heart to pump blood around the body. It's the purpose of the laser in the DVD player, whatever. Now, the thing is that being a good Darwinian, I don't believe that anything has any objective purpose. I don't think that, there's any kind of Aristotelian physical fact about what any aspect of my body is supposed to do. There's certainly no fact at the matter about evolutionary developed purposes being ironclad. It's not the case that you know, coyotes, because they evolved to prey in the wilderness, shouldn't be moving into cities and you know, eating trash and kind of redeveloping their environment and adapting to a new environment. No, there's and talking about how coyotes evolved in terms of the environment they evolved in is just a handy way of understanding how they work as systems and thus being able to predict their behavior. Right? So what we're actually doing in talking about functions is we're making an analogy. We're making an analogy with practical reasoning. Yeah, great. So this is the thing, is I can have purposes. I can give purposes to things. I can do things. So I can, you know, put a timer on my phone so that I will be reminded to do X. So the purpose of that action can be to take part in a wider series of actions, right? That's a genuine purpose, not analogical, right? But we can understand things in nature on analogy with what we can do in terms of having purposes, right? Because it's incredibly useful. It enables us to structure the ways in which we reason about things in terms of success and failure, right? Really, in nature, nothing is successful or fail. Or there's no successes or failures. There's only successes or failures in relation to actual purposes, but it's helpful to think as a fail. So, am I taking way too long to get through this stuff? Right, so let's say functions, right, are an analogy with theoretical reasoning. Sorry, not theoretical reasoning, practical reasoning. So we think about mechanisms and organic systems as if they were engaged in some kind of practical reasoning. Right? There's actually a parallel to this for theoretical reasoning, which is representation. You see, I can talk about the function of Amy's heart to pump blood around her body. I'm just going to keep using Amy to the thing as well. But in no way am I thereby saying that Amy's heart has some kind of representation of that purpose. Amy's heart doesn't have some way of representing what it's supposed to be doing and guiding its action by that representation, right? But there are systems that we do talk about in those terms. There are systems, particularly when we get into the animal kingdom, there are systems where we say, you know, like the frog is representing the fly that is flying past it, and that representation is playing a role within its behavior, sticking out its tongue and grabbing it. Right? Oh, Amy isn't different from the frog, but Amy's heart is different from the frog. I was just talking about, like, say, yeah, Amy. Like, another example would be just. Yeah, yeah. But the frog, in some sense, has representation. We talk about it as having a representation of state. Okay.
Is the frog heart?
No. But the frog itself, when you get into making psychological explanations of behavior in the animal kingdom, as much as in the human kingdom, we start talking about representations, because it's incredibly useful. Because no longer, so up here, like I mentioned that what we do in deploying an analogy of practical reasoning is we help ourselves to the idea of success, and success and failure, right, which is a nominal distinction. In representation, what we help ourselves to is the idea of accuracy. We help ourselves to the notion of accuracy and inaccuracy as a way of explaining how it is that these systems relate to the environment. And importantly, this isn't something we do separately of this. This is a stage up from this. When we talk about systems as having representations of goals, we already have a functional map of them. We're seeing that those representations play a functional role within the system. However, and you might have guessed the punchline here, basically I think that representation, just as functional understanding is an analogy with practical reasoning, representational explanation is an analogy with theoretical reasoning. Right?
So it's a special, representing is a special function, or is it not?
It's a function. It's a special function. It's a particular kind of functional explanation, which we build on top of. So you can see how this comes from thinking about fairly simple animals. We just think about them as their various subsystems as having certain purposes within the context of the larger system. But once you get to sort of high-level animals like the frog, it starts being useful to be able to say, well, actually, no, the particular purpose of this particular subsystem is to have some kind of fidelity or accuracy in relation to its external environment. And so how that animal, the behavior of that animal within that environment can be explained in terms of how the accuracy works within its wider functional economy.
So camouflage being mental classically for camouflage without representation?
Well, that's an interesting example actually. Insofar as it's a counter representation, or so if you want to think of you could say it's an example of misrepresentation, but like deliberate misrepresentation. It anticipates representational capacities within the environment in some sense. I think there's ways of integrating that within the talk. But importantly, and this is the whole thing I'm getting to, is that these are analogies. I don't think that, just as I don't think there's any kind of objective fact about what the purpose of anything is in the world. I don't think there's any objective fact about what the frog is representing with a particular brain state. So we know that when certain things fly past it, a certain brain state is formed. How do we know that that brain state is supposed to represent flies and not lead pellets? Because you can fire lead pellets past a frog, and it will just eat them until it sinks and dies. And evolution, this is an example from Fred Gretzky, and the evolutionary explanation is, people go, but no, the brain state represents flies, not lead pellets, because that's what they evolved to pick out. The frog has evolved within its environment to eat flies, not lead pellets, right? Therefore, we can say something like, well, it's supposed to represent flies and not the other thing. But on the other hand, you could take the frog into a different environment with a completely different kind of insect that it hadn't evolved to eat, but which, if it could eat, the representation would function perfectly well in order to maintain it. And so there's no fact of the matter, there's no useful thing about saying, well, it only represents the things that it adapted in relation to in its environment. There's no fact of the matter about it. It's just that it's really, really useful to be able to talk about it as if it's representing things in the way that we discursively represent things. Okay. Now, if we have this relationship of sort of function as analogous to practical reason and representation as analogous to theoretical reason, this gives us a useful way of thinking about what it is we're trying to do with AI, or AGI. Because what we're trying to do is get from the parochial examples, right, in which something has, you know, evolved to do something particularly local within its environment, purposefully or representationally, right, to the general one, right? We're trying to figure out precisely what it is to get from something that's just describable in functional and representational terms to something which is genuinely reasoning, practically or theoretically. We want to get from things which sort of look like they have purposes to things that can actually have purposes. And things that sort of look like they're representing stuff to things that can actually represent stuff. Right? And I call this analogical bootstrapping. And the reason I call it this is that, pardon me, if we go back to the idea of artificiality, what we're trying to do is functionally decompose what it is to be a theoretical or practical reason. So we're trying to use the functional description of the system, which is analogous, to build up to a non-analogous one, right? And that's what I mean by analogical bootstrapping. Yeah.
What is a non-analogous?
A non-analogous description. Okay.
You said you want to build up.
Yeah. Analogous description. Okay. I desire to have a few good drinks tonight, right? Like the purpose of me, you know, doing this talk that I'm doing now is that I can, you know, afterwards kind of relax and have a good time, right?
Desire.
That kind of, like, you can ascribe to me desires, practical commitments, purposes. Like, you can talk about me as someone who is engaged in something like practical reasoning, completely non-analogically. Like, it's not our analogy when you say, like, Pete thinks he should do this because he wants this, right? Whereas when we say it, when we talk about dogs and we say, well, ooh, he's standing at the door because he's waiting for his master, that's analogical. It's a very good analogy. It's a really, really good analogy. When we describe, you know, amoebas as desiring chemicals and so moving in particular ways, the analogy is weaker, right? But it's still an analogy. But at the level of describing us wanting things as...
So what you say, functional representation is like analogy and metaphor, basically.
I'd say analogy, not metaphor, because it's...
Analogy for function, if it's representation, is more like metaphorical. It is a self-distinction in terms of...
I don't like to use the word metaphor because people have a very permissive view of what metaphor does, whereas analogy is very structured.
Let's do this now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Right, but basically, so here's the program for AGI. The program for AGI is analogical bootstrapping. How do we use functional and representational notions to get ourselves to full-blooded, general purposes and representations, right? So it's at this point that I'm going to take a massive detour and go back to history of philosophy, and hopefully it will make some kind of sense. It won't seem completely jarring.
Hey, do you want to like angle the board a bit that way? So it's over there. Because I don't think anyone online can really see it anyway.
Okay. Right. So, you. Okay. I'm going to talk. I have just kind of moved the thing I was about to point out the way, but I want to talk about freedom. So when I'll introduce it this way. the concept of freedom has a lot of dimensions to it, and it gets thrown around a lot, and often the various different dimensions of the notion of freedom are collapsed together or not appropriately differentiated. So I've got three kind of useful distinctions for thinking about freedom. The first is the distinction between quality and quantity. And so you can talk about being more or less free, right? That's a quantitative way of thinking about freedom. But there are also qualitative distinctions. The most basic of which I've already talked about, which is the distinction between things that can be free and things that can't. Like, you know, you guys, you have, qualitatively speaking, freedom in some sense. You are capable of acting. Anything which isn't capable of acting isn't free, right? And that's the fundamental qualitative distinction involved in freedom. But we can also talk about being, you know, having more opportunities or having more freedom from oppression. And this is where we get in the second distinction, which is reasonably familiar from Isaiah Berlin, which is the distinction between positive and negative freedom. So positive freedom is freedom to do things, having capacities to actually enact certain kinds of stuff. Whereas negative freedom is freedom from imposition and constraint imposed upon you by others. Interestingly enough, well, actually, I'll put the third distinction first. The third distinction is one of my own, but it is there in the history of philosophy. It's between what you might call rational and actional capacities. So, for instance, my ability to, I'd like to say play the guitar, but I can't play the guitar. If I was able to play the guitar, that would be a positive actional capacity. It's a freedom to do something, right? Which is to be distinguished from a rational capacity, which is, for instance, my ability to reason about whether I should go and play the guitar or whether I should go get drunk, right? Which one's going to be better for me? Which one's going to maximize my preference? Great. Even better. That's a great exercise of rational capacity. Rational capacities are the capacities you need to actually use your rational ones. They're the rational capacities are your capacities to make decisions rather than to enact them. Right? And importantly, although these are all kind of neatly lined up, these distinctions overlap with one another. So you can talk about, so for instance, Foucault, one of my favorite philosophers, is interesting for talking about quantitative negative rational freedom. Right? So when Foucault talks about increasing your margin of freedom in relation to technologies of power, right? What he's talking about is being less predictable and less manipulable by those social systems that are designed to influence the way in which you think and act in the world. Right? That is a kind of quantitative increase in freedom from things that affect your rational capacities. And you can talk about qualitative negative actional freedom if you want to. You can talk about them in various different ways. It's useful to be able to distinguish these different dimensions. Right. That being said, I'm going to delve, if I have time, I think we're doing okay. Yeah. I'm going to delve into the history of the concept of freedom. And I apologise to those people who were in Berlin because you've already heard this before, but hopefully it'll be good the second time too. The place I like to start with thinking about freedom in the history of philosophy is Spinoza and Leibniz. And the reason I like to start there is because Spinoza and Leibniz were both incredibly committed to what's called the principle of sufficient reason. The idea that everything has a reason which can be determined for it. Or, as people tend to talk about it in modern terms, to some kind of determinism. Right? They think that, look, everything has a cause. And most of the debates that go on with regard to free will and determinism are all about how to kind of make the idea that we have some kind of freedom compatible with the fact that we are just causal systems. And most of them are really, I just find them really dull and interesting, because I think this is the crucial point. And the crucial point is actually made by Spinoza, because Spinoza, both Spinoza and Leibniz are engaged in this idea of attempting to make the idea of freedom consistent with the idea of determinism. And Spinoza goes a step further. Spinoza doesn't just want freedom to be consistent with determinism. Freedom thinks that Spinoza thinks that determinism is a condition for freedom. He thinks that being free isn't being not determined, it's being determined in a particular way. It's having a certain kind of causal character. For Spinoza, this is being self-caused. The idea is that the more your actions are caused by your own nature, rather than the way in which that nature has been constrained by your environment, the more free you are. Ish. Autonomy. It's for Spinoza, freedom is capacity. But he just thinks that like our power comes from our essence, and that can be diminished by relations to our environment, which can, affect it. Now, Leibniz presents a very different conception of freedom, and the way to see this is really in terms of. So, what's interesting about the Spinoza-Leibniz is it kind of opposes two ways of thinking about freedom by taking them to the absolute limit, and the limit is God. So in Spinoza, right, God is free, right? But God is free, God is the most free, even though God can only ever be the way he is, right? Which is to say, because in Spinoza, God basically is the world, God is nature in nature, right? The world can only ever be one way. There is only the actual world in Spinoza. There's no possibilities other ways the world could have been. Yeah, but God is still free because his essence is completely expressed in the world. Nothing is constraining God. God has just power in creating the world. Whereas for Leibniz thinks that this, as did pretty much everybody else at the time, thought that this was a fairly heretical conception of God, insofar as it seems to kind of like remove from God's ability to choose. It makes the idea of freedom and choice seem completely sort of independent from one another. So in Leibniz has to kind of, although for Leibniz, we are all determined to do precisely what we do in our lives. Because it's not that there aren't other possible worlds, it's just that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. It's the one we're in, right? And so we are determined, whatever it is we happen to do in our lives, just is the best thing that could have happened for the overall world picture, right? But God is not within the world. God is not part of the world. God is the thing that selects between the various possibilities. God's the one who chooses the actual world as the actual world does, right? But you end up with this tension in Leibniz insofar as, on the one hand, you have God's omnipotence, right, which is what he's trying to defend. He's trying to defend the idea that God has the power to realize other worlds than the actual world, unlike in Spinoza, for whom God's power means that there's only going to be the one world, right? So Leibniz wants to say, no. God has more power. God could actually realize other possibilities if he wanted to. It's just that he's also benevolent, so he only wants the best one, right? And you end up with kind of weird tension insofar as you go, well, wait a minute, does that mean that benevolence is part of God's essence? If that's part of his essence, and that's dictating what he's doing, doesn't that mean that there's necessarily only the actual world rather than all the possibilities? So are we back with Spinoza? And yeah, you end up with this kind of weird tension. But the reason that this is interesting is because what Leibniz actually does is to preserve attempt to preserve a certain conception of freedom by separating it off from the causal order. Like for him, freedom, as in God's freedom, real freedom, has to be this kind of eruption into the world, rather than, okay, I've been talking for an hour. Okay. Please do stop me when I talk too long. Now, what I'm interested in is that, in fact, I'm going to draw this. So you've got Spinoza, we've got Leibniz, what I'm interested in is what happens when their debate gets reflected through Kant. The problem with Spinoza, basically, I love Spinoza, he's fantastic, but the problem with Spinoza in terms of thinking about freedom and agency is that Spinoza doesn't have this qualitative distinction between things that are agents and things that aren't. For him, every mode has power and it has this kind of drive to maximize its power. Right? There's no distinction between those things which we take to be genuinely acting, genuinely be free, and those things which aren't. Everything has freedom, right? What Kant does is to, in my mind, basically make the qualitative distinction between things that are agents and things that aren't, and to do it in an incredibly neat and straightforward and basically right way. And this is what I've sort of got over here. What Kant does is to say that there's a distinction between actions and events. Right? Some things merely happen. Right? Sometimes I just trip and fall. Right? And sometimes I throw myself to the ground. Right? There's a difference between things that simply occur, and there's a lot of them going on, and things that are genuinely actions, and there's fewer of them, even though there's still a lot. The question is how you differentiate between the two. And for Kant, the answer is actions are things that someone can be held responsible for.
So if I push you, what do you do?
Well, you pushing me is an action.
Okay.
Yeah. Me falling over isn't. But it depends how you describe
me
it.
accountable for
Yeah.
the fall.
Yeah. You're responsible. If you fell and you tripped me
If
over.
you fall on the floor, the floor is responsible.
No one's responsible. That's the whole thing.
Okay.
Like some things just, shit happens. Right? Shit happens. No one's responsible for it.
Yes.
But actions are actions because people are responsible for them. So what is it for someone to be responsible for something? Right? So, and that question is, well, what is it for someone to be an agent? If someone's an agent, something that can act, there's something that can be responsible. Right? What does that mean? Well, you probably can't see anymore, but I've got this kind of little thing over here with regard to Kant. The first fundamental Kantian insight is this relationship between responsibility and capacity, which is to be able to be responsible, to be held responsible for stuff, is to have certain important capacities. Crucially, the ability to track what you are responsible for. Right? We couldn't hold anyone responsible for anything if they were completely incapable of what they were and were not responsible for. This isn't to say that someone has to be right about what they're responsible for in order for them to be responsible. Right? No, people can be bad at tracking their responsibilities, at keeping their commitments, right? But if they were completely unable to, there wouldn't be any sense in which we could call it responsibility. And what does this involve? Well, basically it involves being able to justify your actions. It involves being able to provide reasons for why you do what you do. Not in every case. It's not saying that, well, in order for any given thing you do to count as an action that you thereby, it has to be kind of caused by some intricate chain of reasoning. Like, say I'm in goal during a football game, like diving this way to catch the ball rather than diving that way. It's not like I've gone through this kind of intricate process of reasoning. I just kind of instinctively reacted. But if you want to say it's still an action, it's still something which is like voluntary rather than involuntary. The idea is that what nevertheless makes that an action rather than something that simply happens is a certain important relationship to my capacity to justify what I do. To be able to kind of retrospectively rationalize it and say, well, I jumped that way because the ball was going that way, right?
Post-rationalization. So when you say the Roomba cannot do that.
No.
You know what?
The Roomba can't. Post-rationalization isn't good enough. Like you need pre-rationalization as well.
Sure.
But fundamentally they're tied to the same capacity, which is a capacity to track one's commitments. Now, this links to the other fundamental insight I think we get from Kant, which is, and this is where I'm going to reintroduce the word conscious to the word, at least the English word that translates for Bewusstsein, which is what Kant uses. Kant, just as he says there's no responsibility with a certain capacity to track one's responsibilities, there's no consciousness for Kant without the capacity for self-consciousness. What does he mean by this? Basically, we think that, like, take the footballing example. The idea is my volition, that whole kind of mental process that leads me to kind of duck and weave this way, follow the thing, and dive that way, right? Even though it's not inferential, I'm not going through and reasoning about stuff, I'm using fairly basic biological heuristics for solving, like, I don't need to do the differential calculus because my brain has evolved this stuff to do it for me, right? And just go that way, right? That's nevertheless conscious because there's the possibility of becoming self-conscious, which is to say, there's the possibility of it actually being integrated into the process of me reasoning, of updating my commitments and engaging in practical reasoning. So there's, to kind of extend the example perhaps unrealistically, you can see that, like, it would be possible for me to be in full flight engaged within those kind of practical heuristics, like ready to go that way, when I remember some important information about the person who's coming at me, like, actually I know he's left-footed, right? I know that's got to be a feint, right? He's not actually going that way, he's going to be going that way. And so I can interrupt that ability and actually decide on the basis of a reason to go that way, right? And that's an example of even if that didn't happen, what I was doing there was conscious because there was the possibility of it becoming self-conscious in an important way. Of being involved in this capacity to track the state of the world and track what I want to do in the state of the world and work out how I'm going to do it. Right. Now what's interesting is the thing about this debate between Spinoza and Leibniz is that this gets reflected through Kant and produces. In fact, I might kind of condense this, but basically, you get kind of two traditions coming out of Kant. One which is sort of Spinozan and one which is Leibnizian. And I find, like, the Spinozan one's far more interesting. It begins with, like, Hegel, and I'm not going to write down Schelling because Ben will, and Diana will. So I would write Schelling there, but I'm not going to for the sake of the Schellingians. But put down, for instance, someone like Sartre is a good example. What you get in someone like Sartre is, so the other thing that Kant thinks is he thinks although he kind of disagrees with Leibniz that we need to think of our action as being kind of uncaused or interrupting into the causal order. He nevertheless thinks that there's a certain sense in which we have to think that way. Like, in order for practical reasoning to be tractable, we have to see ourselves as uncaused. We have to see the options that are put before us as just kind of like ex nihilo, as just being produced by us. We don't want to track all of the various different causal mechanisms in our environment which are causing us to go in a certain way rather than another. And that's this idea of noumenal freedom. People like Sartre take this too literally, and they basically recreate a kind of Leibnizian tradition where they think that, in essence, no, right, what it is to be free is to be this special kind of thing. You're a for itself rather than in itself, right? You have a special kind of causation where you can like interrupt the world, right? And that's what it is for you to be free, right? And in fact, if you think about the things that cause you to make your decisions, then you're in bad faith, right? Then you're just not being free anymore. To be free, you have to kind of realize that you are this kind of like weird metaphysical eruption. Whereas the tradition that comes out of Hegel is far more Spinoza. It's this idea that, no, what it is to be free is to be determined in the right way, which is to say, with Kant, to be determined by reasons, to act on the basis of reasons, or at least rather to be able to act on the basis of reasons. I could say more about the history there, but I'm not going to. How much time have I got? What I would like to say something briefly about is, I think there's a, okay, let's put it this way. You know, I'm talking about these capacities that Kant thinks you have to have in order to be a rational agent. That's just the problem of AGI, the lever gambler. Kant's issue is, look, what capabilities must something have in order to be able to track theoretical and practical commitments? The theoretical commitments are believing that the world is a certain way, and in a certain sense, being responsible for justifying that. Like, if you think that the world is a certain way, you have a certain responsibility to make sure that that's consistent with your other beliefs, for instance. Right? So that's a theoretical commitment, something you're responsible for. Similarly, practical commitment, if you want to do, I always use this example, say I have an ambition, like I'm committed, I want to climb Everest before I die. Like, but on the other hand, I've made a promise to someone, I am never ever going to visit Nepal, or like I'm never going to visit, like, or just say like I'm never going to visit Asia. That's easy. I'm never going to leave the country. I'm always going to stay here, or maybe it's, you know, mother, I have to stay there, or whatever. But those two things are incompatible. Having practical commitments involves being aware of their incompatibilities and getting rid of ones that you can't do at the same time, right? That's a certain kind of capacity, being able to track what you're responsible for, and when your responsibilities are inconsistent, deciding which way to go. These capacities, I'm going to talk a bit more about shortly. Screw it, I'm just going to talk about them. If somebody wants to ask me later, I'll come back to this. But basically, there's an interesting tradition that comes out of Kant. And the figures I kind of talk about there are Hegel and Marx and Heidegger and Foucault. And what's interesting about these people is that, so if you think that what Kant does is to say, here is an abstract diagram of what it is to be a rational agent. All you've got to do is to have these certain kinds of functional capacities or this kind of functional structure, and that's what constitutes you being an individual agent. What Hegel realizes is that if you can make a rational agent out of anything, if this abstract diagram is such that it can be multiply realizable. That you can make a rational engine out of silicon chips and computational machinery or whatever, right? Surely you can make it out of other rational engines. So what Hegel does is go, well, surely if I get a group of people and I arrange them in the appropriate way so that they have the appropriate kind of social relationships, we create social structure, and that social structure will itself have agency. So what Hegel gives us is this idea of collective agency, or what he calls spirit, and it's just a recursive use of the Kantian idea, like rational agents made out of rational agents. And that's just one interesting thing about how this Kantian idea gets expanded into social thought. And I could talk more about it, but I'm not sure I have time, so I'm going to just leave that tantalizingly hanging there. What I'm going to do instead is get into the nuts and bolts. So I just talked about freedom, and now the important thing really is to start talking more seriously about reason. So, you know, I've been throwing around these, or been talking about these abstract capacities, these abstract functional capacities that constitute rational agency. Well, what are these capacities? I'm sure everybody wants to know.
May I ask you just to say again what was Foucault doing in terms of freedom? He was dealing with, you said, quantitative, negative?
Rational freedom.
Quantitative, negative, rational.
Yeah, but he does more than that. I mean, I think Foucault is, I say this all the time, Foucault is the greatest thinker of freedom of the 20th century. I think he's amazing. I just think that that's a particularly unique aspect of Foucault's project, which other people don't really do. And yeah, Foucault, I mean, I see Foucault as, if you think Kant does transcendental psychology, I see Foucault as doing transcendental sociology. It's an extension of the Kantian project in which power is a kind of abstract diagram of how rational agency works on them. Anyway, I'm going to talk about what rational agents are. So this is where we get into Wilfrid Sellars, who is the other great Kantian in the 20th century. And he's the great Kantian because he really appreciates this functional project. A lot of people who read Kant don't appreciate this, but Sellars even talks about trying to design robots and what a robot would have to do to be able to do stuff like this. So I'm like, yeah, great. What Sellars does is basically take. So I've said a little bit of stuff about like the essence of Kant's project, but like if you were to condense it down even further, the crucial thing that Kant thinks you need to explain in order to explain rational agency is judgment. Right, the ability to make judgments, which is just to say to basically make assertions, to claim that the world is a certain way, right? If you want to think about this in syntactic terms, it's about being able to use sentences, being able to use declarative sentences to express propositions. And importantly for Kant, this is necessary both for practical, theoretical and practical reason, because the same sentence that can express the way the world is, or it can express the way the world should be according to you. Right? And I'm going to talk about this more and more. But what Sellars does is to, and this is my gloss on Sellars, but say you realise, okay, let's talk information. Let's say we've only got two different kinds of information today. Right? Say we've got sentences and we've got non-sentences. Right? Fairly straightforward. What Sellars realizes, and what I kind of extend, is that this means you've got basically four different kinds of informational transition. You've got, I'll put it this way. You've got a capacity to move or process that will take you from a non-sentential input to a sentential output. You've got something that will take you from a sentential input to a sentential output. Something that will take you from a sentential output input to a non-sentential output, and something that will take you from a non-sentential input to a non-sentential output. Right? In a sense, fairly abstract. Call them more familiar things. Right? This is perception. Perception is the ability to go from a non-sententially structured piece of information to a sententially structured one, where you can say you get certain sensory material and you go, oh, it's raining outside. Okay. Sentence to sentence is inference. Right? Going well, oh, it's raining outside. Therefore, if I go outside, I'm going to get wet. Right? Sentence to another sentence. You extrapolate and extend the implications of the information you've just taken in perceptually. And then sentence to non-sentence, action. Right? If I'm gonna, if I go outside, I'll get wet. Better take an umbrella. Right? Action. Pick up the umbrella, walk outside. That's a non-sentential output.
Can you explain the difference between belief and induction?
Okay. I know I throw around the word belief. Belief is a bit of an awkward word because it has various different connotations. So, in judgment, I'd rather talk about commitment because commitment is a thoroughly normative thing. So, for instance, like say, take this idea that I'm committed to climbing Everest, right? Therefore, I'm committed to going to Nepal or going to that particular part of Southeast Asia, or not South Asia, whatever. I am committed to that regardless of whether I understand that I'm committed to that or not. Whereas when we talk about beliefs, we tend to be a little bit ambiguous as to whether, so if I believe that Clark Kent is a coward, right, you might want to say, well, you believe Superman's a coward, but if I don't know Clark Kent is Superman, is there a sense in which that's actually what I believe or not? The content of what I acknowledge to be my beliefs doesn't necessarily extend out to what I'm committed to by acknowledging certain sentences. So I should really be a bit more careful in using the word belief because it includes those kinds of ambiguities, whereas just talking about sentences I'm committed to is not. You get what I mean? Okay. Anyway, right. Perception, inference, action, and this is what I call coping. And this is what I meant by the goalkeeping example. Ball comes at me, I jump for it, right? Non-sentential input, non-sentential output, right? It doesn't need to be, there doesn't need to be any reasoning involved there. I just have some practical heuristics for engaging the ball. Yeah.
But in that case, if you play you're in the Super Bowl, right?
Huh?
You're in the Super Bowl, right?
Super Bowl?
Yeah. When you were jumping for the ball?
I thought it was in football. Like
so you're
soccer.
Soccer. So in soccer, you're in the World Championship.
Yeah.
So you played before, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you have a coach and you have strategy.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have a brain, but collectively you have some kind of
strategy
together.
Absolutely.
So how this is kind of present, right? So how come what is your body try to, how does it, and it's in the system here?
No, it is. I mean, what I'd say is
you don't forget all the strategy.
No.
Train evolution of the flying frog.
No, absolutely. I mean, that feeds into what I was saying before. So basically, here's another way of thinking about this whole schema. Sorry if this is a little bit kind of complicated, but I started by talking about thought and action as being like a crucial element of intelligence, right? Now, the other words we could use here would be so.
And the difference, the fact that you distinct them, right?
Yeah, thought and action. But the other words that are often kind of deployed in relation to this is sensation and behavior. Oh, sorry, I should really forget thought there. Thought is supposed to kind of take out the whole thing, but let's say thought is in the middle.
Okay.
And we'll call that perception, right? And perception is definitely part of thought, right? We talk about animals as having sensation and behaviour, and what I'm trying to articulate is that, well, animals have sensation and behaviour insofar as they can go from certain kinds of inputs through certain kind of rudimentary processing to certain kinds of outputs. Right? But that rudimentary processing is not general. It's not general problem-solving abilities, right? This is what it is to have general problem-solving abilities. And having that is what converts sensation and behaviour into thought and action. Mm-hmm. And the thing that, so say, you know, in here, I've got all kinds of like interesting heuristics that I share with animals for being able to process data from my environment and just act on it, right? What's crucial about rational agency is that this information can be, if necessary, rooted through my ability to
potentially.
Yeah. It's conscious because it has the possibility of becoming self-conscious. This is what
a prioritic possibility to recount on what happened.
Yeah. So this is what if I was to kind of if I was to talk about this thing here, what's plainly important, I tend to call it the core reasoning system, which is what maintains your picture of the world. So, you know, you're getting all these sentences in, right, from perception or from wherever. You can also get them from other people. People can just say, well, do you know that, you know, hydrogen only has one proton?
Really?
Yeah, and you're like, oh, great, I'll put that into my store of information, thank you very much. And so you're keeping this store of information about the world. And you know, I don't think that this is in the form of a list of sentences in your head. I don't think that your picture of the world is just a list of those sentences you take to be true. I simply think that there's an important sense in which it's functionally equivalent to that. Right? So what happens is all of this information we're getting, be it from language or be it through our experience in the world, we have to be able to arbitrarily, this is the arbitrary extensible bit, we have to be able to arbitrarily bring it up, represent it in general terms, and integrate it with any other bit of information that is somehow stored within our cognitive mechanisms, be it in terms of habits or our ability to imagine or whatever. We have to be able to integrate a consistent picture of the world as a whole. And the point is that process of taking in perceptual judgments and judgments from other people and synthesizing them and working out their consequences, working out what they are implied by, and developing this kind of consistent picture of the world as a whole. If you project it to the ideal, it's a complicated process, but project it to the ideal, it produces this set of sentences that you take to be true. Your ideal set of theoretical commitments about how the world is. That's what it, as a process, aims at. And I'll talk about the related process tomorrow, which is desire, which is a certain sense in which you have all of these impulses, and you have all of these things you want, and you have to kind of integrate them by arbitrarily representing them and making sure they're consistent with one another, and then getting rid of the ones that aren't consistent with one another. And in a certain sense, ideally, that kind of produces a representation of the world as you think it should be, according to how you want it to be. Anyway, but I'll talk about that more and more. The important point basically is that the integration of all of our information into a kind of unified picture is what we mean by the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness. This ability to be able to kind of relate all of our different sources of information about the world through which we can act upon the world together in a consistent picture. And it's an ideal integration rather than an integration that is ever actually realized. Similarly, getting back to this idea of generality, this idea of like arbitrary extension of our representational capacities is an ideal. And a good way of demonstrating that is to talk about the social example. The fact that people can come along and instead of getting information through perception, some other person can, go outside and say, raining. Do you know it's raining, Pete? I go, oh, crap, better get an umbrella. I've never seen the rain, but I've been given the information. Similarly, I can turn around to someone else and go, would you mind getting me an umbrella? Right? I can get them to perform the action. Right? That means that any of these processes, these cognitive processes from non-sentential and non-sentential stuff, can be passed through a wider social system of social cognition. Right? We can arbitrarily extend our processing through other people, but we can equally do that by technologically enhancing our capacities, by acquiring perceptual capacities that we have not evolved, like the ability to detect whether or not there is an excess of gamma radiation currently going through the room. Right? We'd have a Geiger counter. People like me and people. Shit. We could, and similarly, we can develop capacities for action. We can develop technologies that enable us to do things that otherwise we would be unable to do. New actional capacities. Yeah, we do. But but the important thing is that this is what I mean by general extensibility. It's the fact that we have this kind of structure of well, it's what I call this general inferential economy. Right? We have this kind of inferential economy whereby, so for instance, one of the things I haven't really explained, and this is the other real important side of Sellers, which I haven't gone into, but is for Sellers, the meaning of these sentences, these are just syntactic units. I've just been giving a syntactic distinction between sentential and non-sentential inputs and outputs. Right? The content, the semantic content of these sentences, right, as far as he's concerned, is their inferential role. Their inferential role within the wider economy. So the meaning of empirical claims, like it's raining outside, is actually related to their role within our wider social practices, underlined by our capacities to notice whether or not it's raining. And on the other hand, the content of certain, so that's an example of like empirical content, but the content of value judgments is intrinsically tied to action, the capacities for output and action. So when I say, my favorite example of this is as ever beauty. Like when I say this painting is more beautiful than this painting, right? There's a certain sense in which, all else being equal, right, that implies that if you're in a burning gallery, you can only save one of the two before you everything's consumed in flames. You should save the more beautiful one. Now there are defeasors for that. There are reasons where like you might want to save one or the other because this one's more valuable, and you need the money to pay for your ailing mother's operation or whatever. There are various exceptions to this, but all else being equal, ceteris paribus, seeing that this thing is more valuable than that thing is to say something about how you should act in relation to it. So value judgments get their content from their relation to action, and empirical judgments get their content from their relation to perception. But either of them can only have content insofar as there is this middle bit, inference, insofar as there is this inferential economy, which is also simultaneously what enables us to pass sentences to each other and to say,
okay. So inference has this capacity to project a bit ourselves in a plausible future, in a coherent future related to this one. When I look at this, I mean, me coming from with technology, I see a bit a classical input-output system. So there is an input, it's like a box, there's an entrance, then some kind of processing, and there's output. Lots of people studying perception, like the body, for example, like in France, Alain Berthoz, they say that action constitutes perception. They would combine a bit these two things and put the S as a loop on itself, so not distinguish too much an entrance and an extrance, to put it as the same thing. What do you think?
They can't be the same thing, but they are related. I mean,
you think they can't be the same thing? Like when I shake your hand, look, let me shake your hand. Who is shaking the hand here? Do you shake your hand? Do I shake your hand?
Well, the important thing, I don't know. The important thing is, look, I mean, if you want to talk about a complicated relationship between perception and action, or sensation and behavior, you have to be able to distinguish them in order to talk about the relationship.
You think?
Yeah.
And what about quantum mechanics? Do they distinguish? I mean, do you think we could see them also as an intricate, ambiguous, non-distinguishable entity? I don't know.
I think let's leave quantum mechanics out of this.
No, it's an example in a different domain where they stopped trying to be analytical. And it's true that in a lot of your examples, you start to discern things.
There's very particular. It's a very, very particular and dangerous conceptual domain to talk about the examples in quantum mechanics.
Okay, so let's remove quantum, but let's talk about this. But let's talk maybe later about it. It's okay.
My issue is just that, like, one way of looking at this is to think about informational loops.
Yes.
Right. So the point is, like, whenever I output anything to my environment, that goes back in to the system, because when I change my environment, I get sensory input on how I've changed it. And this is how we recognize failure. You know, how we modify our actions because we go, well, that hasn't quite done, okay. So most of our actions are constantly being calibrated as we're doing them, right? So because there's an informational feedback process going on in the process of action. But it's still worthwhile distinguishing input and output there in order to understand how that looping process works. Now, what I'm describing here is I'm saying that there are all kinds of various informational loops you can create within nature. There are all kinds of interesting information processing systems you can create, which, in a certain sense, we might want to say are kind of sort of intelligence, sort of analogously intelligent, right? But if you want to understand what it is to create a loop which is generally intelligent, in the sense of being arbitrarily extendable, right? This is what it is. It's one which goes through a system which is capable of basically revising and developing its representations in the world in such a way that they can be developed to represent and motivate, in principle, anything.
Can the strategies for coping intervene or disrupt normal functioning inference?
I think so, yeah. I imagine, I don't see why there isn't any reason why, like, I mean, there are many times I'm walking down the street and, thinking about what I'm going to do, and then
specific examples.
yeah, and then occasionally my body kicks in and goes, "Don't walk into the lamppost." So there are obviously ways in which my various bodily systems kind of interact and interrupt one another. The important thing is just that you have what I've been calling a core reasoning system. You have to have the core reasoning system to integrate your representations and enable the possibility to inferentially track your commitments in order to have anything resembling proper agency. How exactly that's configured in relation to your other stuff is it's something that can vary, I imagine.
I suppose I was just interested because it seems that, at least on, again, I'm coming out of reading on Monty at the moment, but it would be that the historically developed strategies for coping in the body can significantly disrupt the functioning of inference.
Oh yeah. Well, the other thing is it's not just that they can functionally disrupt inference; it's that inference can be parasitic upon it. So a crucial thing to understand is so Kant talks about the imagination, the role of the imagination, and the imagination is just the faculty of simulation. We can all simulate the world.
Right.
We can
just
all.
This.
Huh?
Just this. It's sad. Sorry, but you remove the mystical element of it. If it's just simulation, we are like computers.
Yeah,
it's true.
Shit, I forgot the mystical element.
No, I'm almost there. Yes.
No, don't get me wrong. There's a lot interesting to be said about the imagination, but crucially, the fundamental functional role of what Kant calls the reproductive imagination, at least, right?
Reproductive imagination.
It's a bit more complicated, but it's basically simulation, right?
Okay.
The crucial thing is that I'm a big fan of Heidegger. When I talk about all this coping stuff, that's where I'm getting it from. I don't think that we are designed in such a way that we have a whole bunch of stored beliefs and understandings of inference about things like hammers and tools and how they work. We don't, for the most part, we don't engage with most of our everyday kind of technological apparatus in terms of explicitly propositionally articulated beliefs. We don't, right? What we have is abilities to engage with them. But this also is involved in an ability to simulate imaginatively what we can do. So I can, sit and think and be like, well, how am I going to get that, how am I going to put up the shelves and get them through the door and get them in the right place?
In a way.
Well, it's not inference insofar as it's not explicitly articulated in sentential terms, right? It's not explicitly articulated, right?
So where do you imagine here? Where is imagination?
Right about here.
Really?
Yeah. So the point is that on the fly, I can use my imagination as a resource to explicitly articulate beliefs about the world. So I could engage in practical reasoning about this. I could move into inference. And in fact, my ability to infer about, well, what's the best thing for me to do here, all options considered, right? Those abilities are in fact parasitic upon imagination. This is the thing, is that most of our cognitive activity is not inference. Most of our cognitive activity is other kinds of parochial forms of information processing. What's important is that the ability to take this kind of consciousness of the world and our actions and convert it into a certain kind of inferential format enables us to integrate all of our understanding of the world, both in terms of how it is and how we want it to be. Right? It's the ability to, on the fly, integrate these different kinds of information in a consistent form. And the reason it's got to be inferential is that inference is the only place in which the notion of consistency is non-analogical.
And then is what?
Is non-analogical. At the level of inference is where you start talking about incompatibility, where you say, well, look, you can't both be committed to S and P, right? Because P implies not S, or whatever, like tracking incompatibilities and relations of implication between these kinds of sentential representations or propositions is what makes for a fully general and extensible ideal picture of the world as a whole. Right, how are we doing time-wise? Probably, you did start late.
We've got another session starting at 6. So
Okay, well, basically, I hope this makes some kind of sense. There's more, basically, the crucial thing is there's a lot more technical detail in this than I can conceivably display now, particularly because a lot of the technical detail revolves around what I was talking about in terms of semantic content earlier. Like the idea from Sellers, this idea of inferentialism, which gets developed by Robert Brandon and other people, that's where the really intricate stuff is, because that's where you're developing the account of representation. The proper account of what it is generally represents stuff is the account of not just the basic structure of how we use these syntactic markers, but how that use turns into something like general, extensible understanding of the world. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and I could explain more of it, but I'm just going to kind of hint at it. Crucially, just to kind of connect this back to some stuff I was saying at the beginning, things like a lot of people tend to think about like AI in terms of things like decision theory or rational choice theory. And Brandon, on the back of his inferentialism, has a really great critique of this, which is he basically says, look, the problem with rational choice theory, or one of the problems with rational choice theory, is that it takes its semantics for free. It thinks you can make sense of the content of things like goal states, like having a representation of a goal state and a variety of ones that you're going to then try and optimize how you act in relation to how to realize them. He thinks that they basically just assume that they can understand the content of those goal states and their consistency independently or prior to working out how practical reason functions. So they kind of help themselves to all the difficult work that I'm hinting that actually needs to be done. So one of the other ways of opposing the sort of artificial general intelligence paradigm I'm trying to represent to a more classical one, at least one which picks up on things like rational choice theory and decision theory, is to say that in separating out the account of theoretical reason from practical reason, or thought from action, right? Separating out the problem of how we represent the world from how we work out how we act in it. What we're doing is actually to overcome that fault in rational choice theory. What we're doing is actually explicitly engaging with something it just takes for granted, which is actually the real core of the issue, what it is to understand the world, not simply what it is to act in it. Okay, there's a few other kind of weird things I could say, but I reckon let's just have some discussion if that's okay.
Yeah, if you do.
Because I know there's a lot of kind of technicalities there and there's a lot of material, but hopefully I've prepared a hell of a lot less material for the next two seminars. So there'll be more kind of asking questions based on this. This is just kind of trying to give you a rough idea of the paradigm from which I'm coming in order to start addressing questions like, well, if we're interested in creating machines that are capable of representing the world in a general way, like I've been talking about here, what additional problems are there for creating machines that act in the world in general, that can act in the world, and what issues are there to do with things like autonomy and personhood in relation to this? How do we understand what it is for a system like this to be a person or to be autonomous. And I'm going to start talking about those things tomorrow. But once you start getting a vision of what the functional structure of a rational agent is, these kinds of questions become tractable, they become more interesting. So.
Did anyone want to ask any questions? Probably got maybe 5 minutes.
But after, please other. Okay, I have a question about, just 2 remarks to do. One is about Marvin Minsky's conception of frames. You know this? You read a bit what he talks about?
No.
It's kind of mental, representation that imagine we have frames like inference about the world, and you want it to build robots that are the same, right?
Yeah.
And it's called expert system, and there's this kind of, not list as you say, but kind of collection of representation of possible action that you can do everywhere. It's like the Mars rover, you send it to Mars, and there's many different kind of way to react to the imagined Mars planet, which in reality is always a bit different than what we imagine Mars to be. And usually the robot gets stuck, and we need to send another one, and it costs a lot of money. So this is my question. Second one is how to position what you say against situated action, and all this critique of AI and AGI later on by the follower at the end of the 80s, like people like Lucy Suchman. Do you know a bit about this also?
No, to be honest, my actual history of the AI paradigm is really cool.
So it's very interesting. So then just a comment on this, that many people discuss that these schematics that was the foundation for artificial systems, like kind of Herb-Simon derivative robots, has been criticized a lot at the end of the 80s, and it led to the creation of different kind of robots that the robot you describe need to have a big brain, because to store the inference you do, to know that it's rain, you need to have touch rain before. Because in your example, we assume you already were under the rain and you know it's wet, and you know that, it's shit. When you say shit, it's the rain. If you don't know the rain, you're like, what the fuck is that? Okay, so I don't know if you never saw the rain or snow if you live in the desert. So how you incorporate evolution of all of this, and lots of people in robotics, and especially epigenetic robotics, they want to know how to go to this state, because robots, they are not born like us. And they don't have like childhood of robots where they learn about rain and they put them in the snow. No, they don't have this. So how you have this kind of robotic machines that go to this state. And the second thing is about this new class of robots that are not artificial, almost natural, very not general, so very specialized, and super not intelligent. Yeah. So there is this movie called Fast, Furious, and Out of Control. You saw this documentary? It's kind of a mockumentary about the head of CSAIL, the Laboratory of Artificial Intelligence of MIT at the time, the great guy, the guy that invented iRobot, that made the Roomba, by the way. So the class of robots that they did is totally not like the Roomba. It's like a very simple robot that can have a lot of other peers, and they can coordinate. So in this sense, it's very interesting, because what they do is they exchange the knowledge of their own inference that they develop based on their unique perspectives in the world. So they are able to exchange inferences, like we exchange tips how to cook on the kitchen in PAF, which is great. So this kind of, exchange of very particular understanding of situations that makes them be more aware of. So my point here is to say that maybe we perceive and react in the same time. That if we cannot unstick these two,
I think we do perceive and act at the same time. I just think that doesn't mean that there's no difference between perceiving and action. That's
sure,
the point.
But then the point in Merleau-Ponty continuation that was then, I think, kind of proved by physiological research afterward, is that there are some perceptions that we can only have when we act. So I think it's a bit artificial, so to say, to separate in this kind of schematics visually both. I think we never perceive without acting. And here, this is how
that might be the case, but again, that doesn't mean that they're not different things. And this is just meant to kind of
it's a representation.
And the important thing is that by maintaining the difference and working out the difference properly, it gives you a much better appreciation for how the relationship between the two is articulated. So as I say, for me, like that whole looping idea, the idea of informational loops, or what gets called tort cycles, test operate, test execute, which are precisely about the interaction of sensation and behavior.
Yes, but as in a circuit with a before and an after, not in a synchronous time, not acting and perceiving at the same time. First you perceive, then you act, and in between you have some kind of processing.
Well, no, there can be like, well, okay, I mean, when we talk about things happening at the same time,
yes,
right? We don't necessarily mean like the simultaneity is not an absolute simultaneity.
yes.
It's two processes that are processing in parallel. Yeah, right. But they are passing things back and forth one between one another in synchronous ways, like in serial fashion. It's just that there's not an absolute parallelism or an absolute serialism. There's an interesting informational interaction and process.
Okay.
I wonder if there is not a distinction, an additional distinction to be made between the representations that we have and the representation that we make. Like the representation that you have of the ceiling, I will never have access to it. It will be always specific and different from the one I have. There is the representations that we have are precisely these things that we cannot share. But what we can share is the representations that we make out there. So inferences indeed, and artifacts. And I wonder in the system and also in your discourse, there are many moments when the acception of the word representation is not exactly clear. Is it the representation we have or the representations we make? Because then you need the robot question of this, the memory that has to be stored. I like the second robot when it is so specific that we can actually know the representation we have. Because we make it so dumb in a way.
Yes.
And then it's his interaction with other very specific representations that can construct the world, or that can construct a representation of the world. But if we want that the robot can store all the possible representations of any rational agent, let's say, it's already very limited, then it's like a dream that is many dreams that would never happen.
Nice.
I mean, it's important that you bring me up on this because I'm not always as consistent as I should be in using word representation, and partly because it is such a useful word, just like function. Like you just need it. But I maintain this distinction between what you might call parochial and general representation. So the frog that has a brain state that represents the flyer's flying path, that's a representation, but it's a representation in a sense which is analogous to me saying there's a fly, right? And
you mean anthropomorphic?
Not anthropomorphic. It's about basically think of it in these terms, right? This is where we get back into the stuff about inferential semantics that I haven't really explained well enough. But if the content of the claim there was a fly there, right, is its role, its ideal role within reasoning and within discourse, within the kind of inferential economy that extends beyond me to everybody else, right? Then, in making that claim, I can be committed to things that I don't necessarily grasp entirely. I give the example of like, I might not appreciate the fact that saying that something is in, like, saying that someone is climbing Everest implies that that person is climbing is in all weather, right? These chains of inference can extend beyond my appreciation. That doesn't mean that the content of the representation doesn't include them. So we can represent the world in ways which in many ways exceed our own personal capacities because we're part of a wider representational system. Whereas, you know, our parochial forms of representation that we share with animals that represent our environments more or less accurately, the way we understand whether or not they're more or less accurate is in terms of our general forms of representation, talking about it and going, well, you know, really, are you properly differentiating between the various different wavelengths of light there? You know, like, surely you're missing an appropriate piece of information, which we know because we've done the tests. You know, discursive representation enables us to kind of continually get more information and a better picture of how the world is, and that's what enables us to test the accuracy of non-discursive representation. But there's no kind of intrinsic standard of accuracy in the sort of parochial non-discursive representations that animals possess. Does that make any sense? I might have gone a bit off there. I think I need coffee.
Coffee's good.
But this just to kind of like emphasise, to me, this difference between the parochial and the general is really crucial, because that's the whole paradigm I'm recommending is this idea of analogical bootstrapping, trying to move from. So when I'm kind of criticising classical AI, and I don't mean to be kind of like saying that the sorts of projects that you're talking about, developing robots that are really good at doing specific things, I don't think they're worthless. They're incredibly worthwhile. Because precisely any intelligent robot worth its salt is going to have a whole bunch of what I've called coping processes. It's going to have a bunch of parochial systems to representing the world and engaging in doing stuff because they're far more efficient. It's going to have a whole bunch of informational heuristics, right? What I'm trying to point out is that they're simply not sufficient. They're necessary, but not sufficient. You need to have this additional level of self-consciousness on top of the layer of consciousness which standard AI is articulating.
I'm not really clear on how you can intensify or increase your capacity for self-consciousness.
Oh, there's a good some good examples here. I mean, this is actually so I've mentioned Robert Brandon before. Robert Brandon has this fantastic account of what logic is. So Brandon calls logic the organon of semantic self-consciousness. So what logical vocabulary enables us to do, being able to, so I should point out that when I'm talking about being able to perform inferences, that's nothing to do with being able to perform logical proofs. Right? You can track inferential relations between sentences without being able to express those relations. You can do it without being able to say it. What logic or vocabulary enables you to do is to say it. It enables you to go, look, if P then Q, right, and to say, you know, well, you know, if not Q then not P, and things like this. And what that acquiring the capacity to use that vocabulary does is actually, in a certain sense, give you a qualitatively distinct form of self-consciousness. You become able to better appreciate and integrate, appreciate the content of your commitments and integrate them and elaborate them. You develop kind of new positive rational capacity. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's just one example, but you can imagine how, like for instance, a different example would be people who can do biofeedback. People who can like really good at biofeedback and being able to kind of like control their heart rate and things like this. I can't control my heart rate. Like my pulse is not conscious, right? But for someone who can control their heart rate, there's an important sense in which actually that is conscious, because they have the possibility of making it self-conscious. They can deliberately intervene.
But how did they do that, is my question. Like, what did they use from this, or do they use anything from this model in order to increase that capacity?
Well, what they're developing is new connections between. So, I've said you've got a bunch of like processing systems here, right? So you've got information looping from sensation and behavior, and some of it goes through some fairly complicated processing systems. Those processing systems can be independent of our rational capacities or our core reasoning system to varying different extents. Some of them can be entirely independent. Like, you know, we have a whole bunch of lizard brain stuff that just kicks in regardless of whether you want it to kick in or not, right? But there is other stuff that you can figure out ways to wire up. But how you wire it up is a question of practical neurology. It's not that's kind of the applied level of this. This is just like a very abstract schema for describing that sort of stuff.
When you say wiring up, it's physically like growing neural stems?
Probably.
So, you know, robots, they cannot do that.
No.
It's a problem.
Yeah, probably. I mean, to be fair, when I talk about artificial general intelligence, I would say that like my main model of artificial general intelligence, I don't think it's going to happen with robots first. Robots are actually like.
Could this collective intelligence, like?
Well, rather, I mean, it could be collective intelligence.
Maybe to make animals intelligent? No.
Uplifting. You can think about that. I mean, personally, I think we're going to see language recognition is where it's going to happen. It's going to be things that convincingly and effectively pass the Turing test because they understand how to communicate with us. Because basically, you know, like you can have a conversation with a blind man about tigers, someone who has never ever seen a tiger or heard a tiger or had any kind of appropriate contextual relationship. They can understand what you are saying despite not having the perceptual mechanisms to verify it. Like, imagine our first concrete language processing AGIs as people who are in many respects completely blind. All they have are inputs and outputs, or mostly what they're going to have is inputs and outputs to us, where we can tell them things and they can tell us stuff. They might have some additional perceptual and actional stuff, but really, like, the interesting development takes place in.
But they can act a lot, no? Blind people, they can still act.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, all I'm saying is, like, I think because I think this bit is the conceptual problem of AGI.
Yes.
This is the hard bit. This is actually what AI has been tackling. AI has already got a lot of work on this bit,
Yes.
right? So where I think AGI is really going to kick off is in the one area where we isolate this bit, and that's language processing. That's where we'll deal with that problem independently of the other problems. Then we're going to have the tricky issue of connecting these things up properly, and I'm just giving you a very abstract conception of how those get connected up.
Why does language recognition, maybe I'm not...
Language recognition.
But why would language recognition solve the problem of inference?
Because this is because of inferentialism. I'm an inferentialist. I think that language, like the content of sentences in language, so grasping what you're doing and understanding what's going on in using language is understanding of the inferential role of things, being able to play what gets called the game of giving and asking for reasons. There's more to language than inference, but inference is the beating heart of language.
So with language recognition, we don't mean that whatever we're going to create is going to just recognize the words, but also understand.
Yeah, it's AGI AGI turns up at the point at which we can create things that can understand what we're saying. And the whole point of the Turing test is there isn't anything more to understanding what we're saying than being able to use the words appropriately within a wide context.
Would language recognition also include the combination to new?
To be able to do new, yeah. Like what I was talking about in terms of productivity earlier. Like you can't, language recognition means being able to understand new sentences that have never been said before. And also potentially say new sentences that have never been said before.
So understanding and producing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So the combinatory ability.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I would have liked to be able to go a bit more into the details of the inferentialist picture because I haven't, really the interesting stuff about general intelligence is understanding. It's the content of the representations, and I'm just giving you the kind of the rough outline picture because when you get into the details, it gets more tricky and niggly.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.